It's 1 o'clock, pretty much straight up. I'd like to call the January 10th meeting of the Hot Springs Village Finance and Planning Committee agenda to order. We have a quorum here this morning. We are missing a couple of people, but we do have a quorum. A little bit of disclaimer statement work before we get into things. Official recordings, videos, or transcriptions of the HSV Property Owners Association committee meetings and/or board meetings will be done by authorized personnel only and can be viewed on the HSV Property Owners Association YouTube channel and explorethevillage.com. Any other recording, video, or transcription of the committee meeting and/or board meeting is not considered the official record of the Property Owners Association. Now that the official business is taken care of, next order of business is review and approval of the minutes. Kathy, thank you for sending those out.
At the last minute when I've had 6 weeks, but.
Details, always details. So, I took a look through them. I didn't see any required adjustments. I didn't know if anybody else had any thoughts.
Speak of the devil, and that must have gone well.
I'm the devil.
Well,
We just figured you were going to be late and in a bad mood after the HVAC guy got there.
Well, they decided to do it on warranty.
That puts you in a good mood.
That put me in a real good mood. And they took care of it.
That eliminates the bad mood real quick. Good.
a shot of single malt scotch, you'd be in great shape.
Good for you. Good for you. So
Becky had corrected under capital funds policy, the second line, it should be definitions of reserves.
Okay.
Just
Thank
a
you.
typo.
Okay. So thank you for that. So unless anybody has any other adjustments, like a motion to approve the minutes as amended, and
So moved.
second? All in favor? Aye. That taken care of. So the next item was review of today's agenda. Not a lot on here this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. I call this version 1 of the draft fixed assets funds policy because I think that's the terminology change that we're making. And then the second part of that is a discussion of the communications plan because we're making some adjustments both to the legacy reserve funds document and this document. And we probably need to make sure that we clearly communicate the what's and the whys up and down the organization, starting with the board, to be quite honest, and then rolling that out to the folks in the village so that they understand what we're making these adjustments for and why. So I've put out a little bit of material on that. Quick action item review for some of the recent events, just to make sure we know where the action items are, and then any new action item assignment today. Any other items for the agenda today? Hearing none, why don't we start with the draft of the fixed asset funds policy. So the red lines that I sent out were the notes and the updates that Jeff made at our last meeting in December. He was making those updates online and was kind enough to email them out to us. The only adjustments other than what we talked about in our December meeting was the title, changing the title from working capital funds to fixed asset funds, and I made that block substitution throughout the document. So open discussion for the group here. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look through this. Do we feel we need to add anything to this document, further adjust this document? Anybody have any thoughts on any final, I'll call it final adjustments to this document, because I think we've pretty much ridden this horse as far as we can ride it.
I have a question or a comment. First off, I think it's looking pretty good, really good. In section 2, in both A and B, it talks about to be funded through net utility earnings and also to be funded through net earnings. The emergency also calls for the same thing. So I just wonder if you had to make sure that it's like not exclusively funded. This is exclusively funded by net utility earnings. Then the emergency also says the same thing. Just, do you need some clarification? It's just one thing that popped out.
Fair question. Karina, you may have more thoughts on this than I do because you're closer to the accounts than I do, but I think fundamentally, those really are the revenue sources for funding both of these sets of reserve
Right.
accounts, is either the utility earnings or the net earnings
Yeah.
excluding utilities. There may be some other unusual things that might come in there as potential revenue sources, like the PPP plan from last year, but those are exceptions and not
Which in
rules.
those technically would still fall under net excess earnings, because you still have to recognize the revenue. It'd just be, it's other revenue and then carry it down. And to your point, until the board decides to reevaluate the threshold set for the emergency reserves, those will be completed as of the end of this year, whatever it is. And so the intent would be, until those thresholds change, everything would come into here. Then once everything kind of gets reevaluated, to your point again, it could be, okay, is it 50/50 and how do we do that? But it's all gonna come out of
Yeah.
that same pot.
Yeah, there's no question about that. It was just more of, the emergency fund says to be funded through net excess, and then they turn around and, let's say you do a 50/50 allocation. And you may look at it and say, no, it was all supposed to go here, no, it's supposed to all go there. That was all my question was about.
That's a fair
Yeah,
question.
and I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I think the fact that we're about to meet the emergency reserve thresholds, until we reevaluate that,
Yeah.
it's here, but.
Yeah, and I think, Carl, to your point, we're kind of deliberately silent on any kind of funding ratios
Oh,
or
sure,
anything
yeah.
like that between the two, because
would
that's
be,
really
yeah.
the purview of the board and where we are at any particular point in time and what their comfort level is for where they want to put funding.
Yeah. And I guess the second sentence actually may cover all that. It says the funding levels are designated by the board, so.
Could we clear that up by saying excluding funds put into the emergency? Excluding earnings put into the emergency?
Well, I mean, I
And
think,
that tells you got both of them, but it does tell you,
I just wanted to bring this up. I'm okay with the way it's written. I just wanted to bring it up to see if there were any other significant concerns about it, so.
It's a fair
that's a
point.
good point.
Fair point. So I appreciate you bringing it up. I don't personally, I don't see any issue with the way it's worded. I think it's flexible at this point, and I think it should be, as and said, the board is going to set those funding levels, both in this policy and in the emergency reserves policy, where they feel comfortable setting them at any particular point in time, so. Okay. Good thought, though. Anything else, sir?
well, and I think because we're not stating 100% goes to, I think it still leaves it open for that flexibility too.
Does anybody else, this is just a question in 2B, when the remaining part to be funded through blah, 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 funds remaining at year end in which the project is no longer assessed to be needed, or if priorities changed. I mean, it says it right, but it seems like if the funds instead of the project, or something, that reads awkwardly to me, possibly.
Which piece?
In 2B, the first sentence, that when it starts the blue part, to be funded through net earnings excluding water and wastewater operations and funds remaining at year end in which the project is no longer assessed to be needed.
I think some of that was deleted,
Oh, I was
Kathy.
gonna say,
Yeah,
some-
something scratched
Okay,
out.
I've got an old one.
Yeah, Jeff's revision was to be funded through net earnings excluding water and wastewater operations and funds designated for a specific purpose.
Okay. I like this better. I'm looking at an old version, my apologies. Just testing everyone.
Nah, no problem, no problem.
Do we want to go back to, Tom brought this up, but said he wasn't going to bring it up again? Whether this should be a chapter 1 article or a chapter 9 article?
I'm agnostic. I think
You said you were
what
going
we-
to bring it up again, but you
Yeah,
made
I
a point.
I said I
think,
wasn't going to bring it up.
yeah.
I know.
I think what we can do, as far as I'm concerned, what we can do is we can put the policy in the hands of the board, and they can decide where they want to put it. Because at the end of the day, it kind of doesn't matter. You know, you've still got you've still got a rather voluminous set of policy documents that we're supposed to be following. They should be ticked and tied, and they have to periodically be cross-checked with one another. I think it brings up a broader issue that I'm not sure we're going to dig into. And that's that we probably, somewhere along the way, need to take a look at the policy documents and make sure that we have clearly identified the responsible parties for the various aspects of the policy documents. Number one. Number two, make sure that those responsible parties are actually entities that still exist in the organizational chart. You know, for example, in the reserve policy, we made some adjustments, and one of the adjustments was we changed the title. I think it was the CFO, and I think we changed that back to the controller because the CFO position disappeared, but the policy document wasn't updated to reflect that. And the only reason for doing that is making sure that the various leaders in the POA understand where they have roles and responsibilities related to the operating policies of the village so that we don't confuse people. But I don't think that's necessarily an action associated with this document, but I think that's kind of a general observation that somebody probably needs to look into that, since all of the policies kind of cross all kinds of roles and responsibilities. That's probably an internal staff thing.
Before the committee went to work on some of these policies, there was a list of, I accumulated a list of some changes that needed to be made, and through the work of rewriting some of the policies, we've taken care of a few of the changes. Some of them were just old typos or forgotten when the guide was retyped. I'd like to discuss this with Karina eventually, but there are still 4 policies in Chapter 1 that probably fit with, or should be moved to Chapter 9, because I think you intended, when Chapter 9 was started, finance, accounting, and strategic planning, I think when you started that, the intent was for these budget and specifically named financing policies would be in there. So we can talk about that, but the board initially wanted me to give them a list to be voted on for any of these little typo type changes. CFO was no longer here. And by the way, in the policy we're discussing now, beginning in section 3 and 4, we have comptroller. And the association, whether good, bad, or indifferent, chose controller as the title, not comptroller.
Okay. I'm looking real quick. I see controller down in
I think it's
the
in
bottom of the
section
first
7.
paragraph in section 3, but it's controller and not comptroller.
Right, and then in section 4, just below the chart.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That one is incorrect, you're right.
And I'm not sure if it appears anywhere else.
It's in chapter 7 of my old thing, but it's as controller.
What I'll do, Gary, is I'll go back and search for it and make sure, but That's a good catch.
At least until it's changed again.
Well, you know, you're kind of kidding and you're kind of not.
Well,
And
we have to have a little sense of humor with the way some things evolve in the world.
well, hence my comment about I'm kind of agnostic regarding its location. You know, because typically, you know, if we try to tie the documents to an org construct, the org construct changes and then you end up moving all the documents around, you know, and that tends to become a little tedious after a while, you know. So I which is why I say I would be more interested in making sure that the responsible parties who have roles to play in the various documents are clearly identified and aligned to whatever the current org construct is. Because if the org construct changes, then you're going to go back and do a lot of administrivia type work that really isn't going to have any value add.
Keep it simple.
Try to keep it as simple as we can. I mean, that would be my thought. But at the end of the day, like I said, which chapter you want to put it in, this kind of doesn't matter to me. So we had the comptroller to controller. Tom, did you have any
Yeah, I do.
thoughts?
It's going to be, as normal, a little bit long and complicated.
Okay.
It's not that complicated. We use the term minimum and target through the document. If you go to section 4, it says, to establish the funds, the board of directors has designated the following, and the word minimum is specifically struck. When you go down to the table, it uses the word minimum. If you go down to section 6, the second sentence says, it is suggested that the minimum levels defined in section 3, I think it should be section 4, but it's not clear to me that we intended to actually define the word minimum. And then it says, next sentence, if any fixed asset account falls below 80% of the balances established in section 3, it should say section 4. It just seemed to me that kind of the intent was, if you're going to actively use this account for spending, we may spend the entire year below 80%. It just depends how we're going to operate the fund. I think at the end of the day, if we kind of sort of leave everything as is, we can live with it. It just, to me, it just wasn't tight enough, that's all. Maybe I'm being,
It's okay.
Overly,
It's okay.
you know.
So I heard three different points.
Yeah,
So
like I
let
said,
me-
it's
let me
a little bit
kinda- Let me
complicated.
kind of go through them a bite at a time. Let me start with the simple one. It looks like in section 6, there were a couple of references to section 3 that you think really should have been in section 4.
I think.
And I'm inclined to agree with you because that's where we set the funding levels.
Right.
So I think that one is kind of a quick and easy kill, and I think you're right. As far as the philosophy that you may spend the year below your minimum thresholds or until you get very close to the end of the
Right.
year, I think you're absolutely right. As one of the intents of these funds is to be able to early start expenditures, to be able to get things done in the calendar year and reduce the amount of rollover into the next year and the ensuing pain, suffering, and explanation that comes with all of that. You're right. These funding levels may actually be below the threshold levels for most of the year, but by the end of the year, by that November, December timeframe, they should catch up. And-
I
and
agree,
and
but the
make money.
continuation of the sentence says, at the end of the calendar year, budget will be allocated to restore the balances in no more than 3 years. And I just thought that struck me as odd. I mean, normally you would say, you would have a plan to get it to the balance in 3 years, but so much can happen in 3 years that it just seemed like almost a pointless statement. I am fine with saying you want to catch up by the end of the calendar year, in which case, if that's your intent, I tend to say, we'll just say that. But, so that's why the whole, that entire sentence, to me, just seemed odd. I didn't know what to do with it.
So
But that's your second point.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm open to the time span. But the concern that I have is putting a hard number on it and saying I must get back to that number by the end of the calendar year.
But I think the intent is to get to the end, at the end of the calendar year. And I'm okay with just saying that.
Yeah, under normal circumstances, I'd agree with you. I think you could conceive of abnormal circumstances that would cause you to draw funds that you didn't anticipate having to draw,
Sure.
you know?
Another side of that is the fact that really there's two purposes for this. One, like you guys stated earlier, is we're able to execute purchases earlier in the year when they're actually needed versus when that revenue is expected to come in. And then replacing that money by year end to get to that minimum balance. But the other side of this equation is to also use it as a savings portion. So when we know we're gonna have a $3 million project coming up that we need to get to, once we expend that, we're not going to be able to have a $3 million right back into the account at the end of the year.
Exactly.
So I think, to your point, it's there for the flexibility of both pieces, but still trying to recoup
Yeah.
and bring it to a balance that we're comfortable with.
And I think the other part of that is, and that's a great example, if you have a $3 million expenditure, you've been saving money for it, to use a household term, and then you actually pull the trigger and make that expenditure, well, you're clearly gonna spend that $3 million. The board would have the option of changing those minimum thresholds that they're targeting. You know, if they knew they spent $3 million, and the odds were that you could not recoup it in a 3-year window, then your other option is you change the target. You know, and you say, we spent that money, we're gonna rebuild it, but we're gonna reset the target lower for the next year or two until we understand what our replenishment rate actually is.
You're also looking at, if you do have the 3 million in there, you're not necessarily looking at having replenished the 3 million. You're only looking at to replenish whatever you need to get up to this minimum amount. So
Exactly.
it may only be 500,000 even though you
That's
spent
true.
3 million.
That's true. You know,
Yeah.
depending on whether you've been bumping the minimum as you
Right.
go along, or
Right.
whether you've held the minimum and you've just been saving for that big
Right.
outlay. Yeah. Either one of those paths gets you to a reasonable landing, I think.
Do we need to be more specific in our purpose then? The purpose is A, to have the money to be able to prepay stuff, and 2, to save up money for foreseen upcoming projects.
Thought it was like that.
I thought it was in there somewhere.
I think it is.
I think it's in,
But it's kind of buried, and I'm wondering if we need to say like 2 purposes.
isn't
One,
it in
two.
section 4, the funding philosophy?
Yeah, it should be in, well, we moved that to section 3.
Section 3.
Yeah, it should be in the philosophy section, that, we're looking at it to do 2 things. One short-term and one more long-term. And the second one doesn't really strike me in here.
I'm looking.
Doesn't it say upon board approval of a change in targeted minimum fund levels, the table in section 3 will be updated to reflect the board decision? Seems to me that covers a great deal of it.
But,
It's in that
that's
version.
kind of different. I mean, putting a savings account and a long-term savings account versus a 1-year savings account are 2 different things in my head.
Well, I think it's in there, because most of the first part of paragraph 3 talks about the whole concept
Yeah,
of
first one.
pre-funding, of having money to early start activities. But when you get down toward the, matter of fact, the second paragraph, Says beginning in '22 and at least biannually thereafter, board in conjunction with the GM and controller, with advice finance planning, will review and confirm the asset targets looking forward 3 to 5 years. And that 3 to 5 year look ahead is really intended to encompass those, what we called known unknowns in the FRAD F timeframe, things we knew we were going to have to expend money on, but we didn't exactly know at that time when those funds were going to have to be expended. So I think it's in there. It's not necessarily entirely explicit.
That came from Larry, who got it from Jeff, I think. It's the tracking on it.
Yeah, these are Jeff's changes from our last meeting, with the exception of the changes in red, because I think those are the only adjustments that I made.
And Larry sent it out with the,
Yeah, and it's some of those that are
The
in red
agenda.
that,
Well,
to
I
me,
think-
reflect what you want, but.
The first sentence under section 3, philosophy, I think maybe is covering what we're talking about, because it says to adequately fund both current operations and provide timely execution savings for approved capital, which may begin at the beginning of the budget year, which revenue has not yet to be collected, or which will require funding over multiple years.
That's true.
Yeah.
so that's really the sentence. Thanks.
Okay. So let's see, that took care of 2 of the 3 points, and I'm trying to remember what the original point was, Tom, I'm
After
sorry.
having read it another time, what I'm kind of drifting toward is under section 4 would be, I think when we say targeted, it's really just a high-level concept. So I was originally thinking that maybe we wanted the word targeted to be defined, but I've changed my mind.
Okay.
When you get to section 4, where it says, to establish the funds, the board of directors designated the following minimum, with the word minimum struck. At this point, I'm thinking putting it back in. It's referred to in the table as minimum amount. And I would like to see the word minimum in the first sentence capitalized, because that's the way I like it. Probably doesn't have to be capitalized, but then it's clear, it referred specifically to those 2 numbers.
I'm kind of in the, if you want it blue, we'll turn on the blue light mode there, if that works for you.
And when you get down to section 6, it says, it is suggested, however, that the minimum levels defined in section 4, I would capitalize that section 6, second sentence.
Copy that. Easily doable. Okay, so I think that hit the 3 points you were
Yeah,
talking about in that section.
That's it.
And do you have anything else, sir? Okay. So,
Just one clarification, this may be, I missed something along the way. You're gonna have your minimum amounts, 666,000 for the utility. The funded amounts, can the board say, not change the minimum, but say, let's put in $1 million and make the funded amount 1.6 million, while the minimum stays at 666?
I
So
think so.
to the question about designated the following amounts, you're talking about a minimum amount, and you're also talking about a funded amount, 2 different amounts. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure minimum would be applicable in there, would it?
well, I think the reason that we put a minimum in there is you don't want it to be 0. You want it to be
Yeah.
something non-zero.
Yeah, no, I get that. In the chart, that's fine. I was just talking about in that first sentence,
Oh, well,
where it just says the board has designated the following amounts.
mhm.
They designated a minimum, and they've designated some funded amount.
Well, I'm gonna bring back up the argument, though, of, okay, what if you've been setting aside this money, you know you have this big expenditure that you've been setting aside for, and you're gonna end up dropping it below 1.5 million. And that's gonna take us a while to rebuild. Is that statement where it says of the minimum amount gonna then be saying that we're out of compliance?
I don't
Isn't what-
think so, because you've already got language in there that says if you drop below 80% of minimum, you put together a replenishment plan with a not to exceed 3-year timeline. But it's a fair question.
I mean, that was the point I was trying to make earlier.
Now, maybe I misunderstood what Carl said, but weren't you saying the minimum would be 666?
That's the utility fund, the
That's it.
1.5 is the
Okay.
general.
Okay.
I
Well,
mean,
but the point being, you'd have a minimum threshold there. You're saving up, your example, you're saving up for a known expenditure 2-3 years down the line. You leave the minimum at whatever the minimum is. You change the funded amount upward to account for the fact that you're putting money away for that eventual expenditure. You finally get to the point where you make that expenditure, well, the funded amount's going to drop because you expended those funds. As long as it doesn't drop below the minimum, life is good. The funded amount reduces to reflect reality, and nothing really changes. Now, if you took it below the funded amount, took it below the minimum amount, okay, if you took it below 80% of the minimum amount, then you've got to put together a replenishment plan. If you missed it by $100,000 or $150,000, you'll probably take care of it under ordinary business. But if you draw it down $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 below the minimum amount, then the first thing you want to do is you want to get it back to the minimum as expeditiously as possible. But you don't necessarily want to, my opinion, box the board in too dramatically, because if you force them to fund this, then that's money that doesn't go somewhere else where funding might also be needed, like a roof on a building or a culvert repairs or something like that. So you have to give the board a little bit of flexibility to be able to maneuver inside of these documents. So, I have a suggestion here, since there were a couple minor red lines in here. I'm gonna go in and make the adjustment, comptroller to controller. I'm gonna go in, capitalize minimum in a couple of places. I'm gonna go into the first sentence in section 4 and restore the word minimum there. I'll put out a version of this today or tomorrow probably. That'll be a quick fix for folks. Can I ask for an email vote on this so that we don't have to wait 2 weeks to finalize this? And I'll send out for those of you that have used email, sometimes you can put out voting buttons on some of the emails and tell me whether you approve or disapprove. And then if you approve, we'll push it on to Katrina for the board's consideration.
I have one more comment. This is after sort of writing on Carl's comment. Is there anything in here that makes it clear that the board, at its own discretion, can just put more money in here? I mean, that is the intent, is it not? So is there anything in here that either makes it clear that they can do that, or is that even necessary?
I think the answer to your first question is no, and I think the answer to your second question is, it depends on what kind of a mood you're in that day.
Okay. I mean, if it's our decision as to whether another sentence in there, which to make things ultra clear, then I guess that's something we should discuss.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if that's belts and suspenders, or good idea, or just unnecessary.
Do we get back up in section 2 where it says funding levels designated by the board of directors from time to time as described below?
Yeah.
Does that answer what you're asking, Tom? I think it does. It says
Okay.
they get to change it at their
It would
will,
appear
more or
to.
less.
Okay,
It would appear to, because it doesn't specify which of the funding levels or any of the specific funding levels that are there.
okay, so it says you can read that and say we can fund it kind of anytime we want to, or anytime the board wants to, up to any level that feel appropriate. Then where does it say that the minimum funding levels should be established.
First sentence of section 4.
First section of section
To
4.
establish the funds, the board of directors has designated the following minimum amounts.
Right, I mean, there's a thought that every couple of years, the minimum funding level should be revised, or reviewed anyway.
I'd agree with revised, I
Yeah,
don't know.
just reviewed.
Yeah, I believe they would have to, the board, as they execute their business and as they adjust these funding levels, would potentially adjust the minimums and certainly adjust the funding levels on, depending on where circumstances are.
Especially with what's going on with inflation.
Well, that's possible, though this is probably not gonna be the kind of thing that you're gonna use. You'd hope this isn't the kind of thing you use to pay salaries. This is more the kind of thing you'd use to deal with an unexpected event that would occur.
But the cost of that event is gonna go up with time with inflation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, you do something like you have another situation like we had a couple of years ago on Valeric where you actually had a culvert collapse and close the road. Well, that's a must fix. You know, if you don't have the money in operations, you're gonna have to go get it from one of these funds to be able to go take care of it.
Okay, so to make things clear, section 3, the second paragraph, starts with the word beginning in 2022 and at least biennially thereafter. The Board of Directors, in conjunction with the General Manager and Controller, with advice from the Finance Planning Committee, will review and confirm adjust fixed asset targets looking forward 3 to 5 years. Do we really mean to say minimums with a capital M?
No.
No. Okay.
No,
and-
because
and that's-
it's not adjusting the minimum, it's adjusting the funding levels that we're trying to get to.
Right, that's the way I interpret it. So the question is, do we need a sentence that says that the 1.5 million should be reviewed separately and specifically? Because I think I thought with the reserve policy, that was the intent of the wording. The reserve policy numbers should, in and of themselves, be reviewed.
I agree, but I think it's a different situation in
Yeah.
reserve policy than
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
You know, in reserve policy, you're really looking for your long-term emergency funds.
Right.
And if you feel uncomfortable with the reserve amounts that you have, then you probably have to look at raising those minimums. In this case, this is more of an execution, you know, planning kind of an exercise that says I've got projects A, B, and C that are gonna require these funding levels and these timeframes, and I'm doing what we can, we're doing what we can to establish those funding levels to be able to pay for those things when they come about, or at least provide enough funds to allow us to start those activities and arrange appropriate financing to be able to pay for the rest of it, be it a loan, be it a bond, be it something else.
I see the controller's responsibility to stay on top of that.
Exactly. I would think the controller would be the hub of this entire wheel, because they'd be the person who'd be in a position to say, you know, we can afford to put money away and we're good, or we can afford to put money away to this point and we're either gonna have to find more money at that point, or we're gonna have to finance, or we're gonna have to do something. But I would think that would be the controller really. There's a lot of people that are involved in this process, but I think the controller really is the hub of all of this.
Is their life that's gonna be hard or easier based on having this in place?
I'd let Karina answer that question.
I was gonna say,
Well, it's 6 one way, half and a dozen another, so the fact of actually being able to let operations and transactions flow as they need to throughout the year, that's gonna be easier, so to me, like I said, you're just kind of splitting the
That's what I
basket.
mean, it affects you, your function, it
But
affects your function.
it will affect my function to a degree, but it's like I said, it's gonna be clearing up other issues. And as long as we can make sure the organization can function in a more efficient manner, that's the true intent. And whatever is on the back end, it's on the back end.
Yeah.
And just because sometimes you don't speak in your own behalf, are there any ways that this could be simplified to make it easier for you? The policy itself?
I think overall, we've done a pretty decent job. I know, there's kind of still the question as far as minimum funding and all of that. The only thing I would say is, I would be paying more attention to your funded amount, your target amounts,
Yes.
and to what Larry was trying to say. Our emergency reserve, that's really that nest egg you set aside. If we go and start saying, okay, we need a $3 million minimum amount in here, you're gonna start having questions.
Yes.
We need to make sure it's enough to adequately get us through the future, but not necessarily stockpile all the cash variant in the backyard type situation either.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the answer is, do these policy statements make life easier or harder? It's the classic consulting answer, it depends. It depends. It depends on where we are in the economic cycle. Right
Yeah.
now, courtesy of the assessment vote, plus pretty good times in terms of home sales and interest in the village and new homes and all of that sort of thing going on, life is good right now. The Fed signaled 3 rate increases this year, probably at least a quarter point apiece, maybe one of them a half a point. So money's going to get about 1 point more expensive between now and the end of the year. That's going to slow down activity. Exactly how much, we don't know. Probably not enough to have a huge impact on us near term, but 2, 3, 4 years out. If you can predict that one, you're better than I am. We just don't know. But at least it positions us to be able to start putting those plans in place. And that's all we can really do. And then it's going to be an exercise in adaptation as we go forward. As long as we have the money to do the things we need to do, then we can continue to roll on. If we start coming up short, then we're going to have to start making those hard decisions.
Well, and really, that's the whole point of this. Like I said, we haven't always had such a great financial standing. And in the past, come July or so, all capital spending, fixed asset purchases, whatever it is you want to call it, stops. And so this is really to help make sure that when we are in a situation that it's not as liquidable as it is today, we can still get through. So right now, it's not a big issue, but it's saving us for the bad tomorrow. And so I think what it provides us is well worth it.
Yep.
No matter what it is, as far as extra work.
Cool. Okay. So as I say, unless anybody has any objections, I'll take the action to do the minor updates that we talked about. I also need to change the section reference in a couple places. I'll push that back out via email and ask for votes, positive or negative, on whether to accept the document and move it forward. So the other item on the agenda is, how are we going to explain this to people? Because what we're doing, we all pretty well understand, and I think we all recognize that it's the right thing to do. But how do we explain that to the average villager out there, about what we're doing and why? So I put together, I call it a communications plan. It really wasn't. It really was more of I didn't word that very well, but it was more of a communications outline. But it was the kind of things that we needed to let people know. The first one was pretty obvious, which is us at the board's request. What did we do? Which we really have done 2 things. We've revised the reserve funds policy to call it emergency reserves, which seems like a subtle change, but it's not. And then we've created this policy regarding fixed asset funds, which the funds were put into place last year, and all we're doing is really codifying the rules of the road around them. The when would be when the board approves the revisions to the policy documents. The where is pretty simple, because it's going to be in our policy documents online. The why is the part that makes it a little bit more challenging. Minor typo on the first Y. Make it clear, I think, both to the board and to the community, why we've made those adjustments in reserve funds. I did ask, and Gary, thank you for the feedback you gave me last week. I talked to Katrina, and that reserve policy to emergency reserve policy change has not yet made it to board discussion and decision. So I don't know exactly when that's going to occur, but I think it's probably going to pop up on your calendars pretty shortly. So I think part of what we probably need to do accompanying these changes that are going to come to the board is to kind of explain to the board why we're doing it. Because not everybody on the board may necessarily be cognizant of why we're recommending these adjustments and why we think they're good ideas.
So your thought is this would be like a cover to the proposal sent to the board?
I think it would start out as a cover letter for the proposal sent to the board, and then I think we could take a lot of the same salient points out of the points we made to the board, and that needs to become part of a communications plan to the community. Because the vast majority of the community, to be honest, is not really going to worry about it too much one way or the other, as long as we're not asking them for more money than we already have. But there are some folks in the community who have a little more financial understanding and who like to take POA financial information and draw conclusions from it, however accurately or not. So we need to be able to communicate the intent of some of these changes so that those folks at least have the opportunity to understand what we're doing and why. Whether they choose to agree with it or not is something we cannot control, but at least we can tell them what we're doing and why.
I like the idea. Most proposals that come from staff to the board have a workup with the proposal. So this, especially here where we started on one proposal and we sort of branched out, and it all makes sense, but if you didn't follow each step, then you might not know what the purpose was. So I like it.
Okay. But you just raised a very good point. At least for the board part of the discussion is a little bit of a how did we get here?
From my point of view, that can be broken into two steps. I mean, normally, on the first, second Monday? Wednesday. So the first Wednesday of each month, there's a working session. You could present this formally to the board with just an explanation. The second part is when the drafts go for approval, Gary would write a memo saying, I am proposing the board adopt these.
Yeah, the proposal.
You could attach anything you want to the proposal. Getting it beyond that scope, I don't know. I mean, I don't know you want to put these memos in the Friday bulletin. I assume not. But at least the two steps that I think could happen are talking to the board at the working session and then attaching explanation to Gary's
And it'll be
proposal
with
to the form of the second Wednesday.
And it'll be with the committee minutes also.
Yeah.
I assume.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think, to your point, you raised a real good point there, Tom. I don't think this is Village Digest on
Yeah,
Friday
yeah.
communication information. But what it is it's background information that probably needs to be put into the public record at the time that the board votes on these policy changes. And it's information that can be given to the Village Voice as a handout for that background on why the changes are being made, because the outcome of the board meetings typically shows up, at least excerpts from it show up in the Voice. So
And that was-
those kinds of things anything we can do to make this easier for people to be able to wrap their head around and understand, I think it's good stuff.
And that's what I was gonna bring up. Once it goes to the board and comes in here for discussion, the voice will have access to it. And if you do like you said, you've got a better chance of making sure that the voice has the right information.
Well, on the agenda, on the Monday prior to the Wednesday board meeting, if Gary has a proposal to the board, it is posted. You can download and print it out. So the voice would use that.
May.
I mean, you
not.
can hand it to them if you want to.
That's
But-
Lewis.
Well, they usually go
That's the
over
normal
a
process.
background before they open it up for all of the
Right.
changes and stuff, so that's
Mhm.
the information that would be in that background piece of the memo.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think really what the intent of this was to make sure that we were putting the right information first in the hands of the board and then into the hands of the public. Yeah. And we can handle this one of two ways. I think depending on whether folks want to do it here or whether we want to take a look at it a little bit. But the second attachment that I sent out, which is draft statement, would initially be used as the background information for the board as they go into their deliberations on this. And then, once the board has determined their course of action, then it would potentially be material that would be presented at a public session before the board actually makes these official statements and serves as documentation to provide to whatever reporter from The Voice covers the board meeting that day. So we can go through this and look at redlining the statement, or you folks can take it home and think about it and send me whatever feedback you want to send me. Because I think the timing of this will probably depend on, is a little bit TBD right now because we don't know when this is actually going to make it to the board calendar as we sit here right now.
Right. The prior policy, the first policy, the emergency reserve funds policy, was just sort of put in the hopper. But I'm going to try to hold that now until this one is ready, so they can be presented at the same time.
That may not be a bad idea. Or at least the background needs to be understood, whether, both for the board and the public. If these go to the board in two different board meetings, I mean, I think that's up to the board, how you want to bite that off.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to ask for.
Okay.
Previously, it was just put in the hopper, so to speak, while some budget items and some other stuff was kicked around, but I believe I'll try to get these two put on at the same time.
Okay.
Do we want to leave it, chapter one, speaking of emergency reserve funds, do we want to leave that policy, chapter 1, article 10, or?
I have no preference on it.
You don't care
It
either
was
way?
the old
Okay.
board that started to break them out, and so as they were revised or a new one was put in place, that's where it got into chapter 9. Anything that hadn't been touched yet was chapter 1. So, if you guys want to consolidate it back, you want to move everything,
Well,
it's just a hodgepodge at the.
I used to have a none too charitable statement I would make when I was working, when we were doing something that wasn't particularly value added, and I called it rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
yeah,
You know, it's a little bit like the band. You know, the band played till the boat went down because they didn't have anything else to do. But, you know, if it's not really value added, why waste your time doing it?
But in the long term of stuff, I do think we do need to decide what's the best place for all of those. Do they need to be separated like they initially started, or reconsolidated in one area or the other? But, like I said.
there are some goofy looking things on the policy guide. Eliminated, what was it? Anyway, we won't go into all that. That's dust cleanup day.
Yeah, I think at least most of us here, I think, are kind of agnostic about which way we go with that one. I think that may be a staff decision, that may be an incoming general manager decision, you know, whatever. Yeah, I think The thing I want to make sure of is we've got the right stuff in the policy statement. What paragraph the policy statement is, I don't care.
I prefer have anything that's financial with anything else that's financial, and not have to read through how many different articles to find this piece of financial and that piece of financial.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, hopefully I'm not violating what I promised. My point of view is that these two revisions or additions, they're pretty closely related. And the way things are, you're gonna have one in Article 10, the other in Article 30. It's much easier at this time to move them to Chapter 9 and have them right next to each other, since they are related. The only issue I have with this is that they are separated by 30 paragraphs. And sad to say, I hate to say this, I do read the policy documents, and because they're so voluminous, and I pretty much mostly just read the financial stuff, it's really inconvenient for me to have to go up and down trying to find the stuff that I want to read. And in this case, it seems like such an easy fix to move them next to each other.
Yeah.
That's all.
If it's financial,
I
put it
will
with
never speak of this
financial.
again.
Well, that's why I said that, I think what they were doing is they created a new chapter to try to consolidate and separate out. So as things were being revised, whether it was one word or whatever, once it had a new revision date on the bottom of it, they were moving it down to the bottom. Both of these technically would be new for one, revised for the other, and they could easily be moved. It's just the rest of those things that are in Chapter 1 haven't been changed yet.
And you
But
can
that's
always mark them deleted, and, you know, like, one that's in the middle of the section can always be changed to deleted and reference a new.
You can just move the whole thing at once.
That's it. Administratively, I think,
Yeah, if this was,
I think I'm agnostic to it. Like I said, whatever makes the folks that have to execute these things on a day-to-day basis happy.
Does it require a lot of work to do that, or approvals? Why not just do it if you can easily?
I'll ask Katrina.
well,
She does
if-
all of that.
If I see no objections, when I make the proposal for emergency reserve funds, it's going to be in the new chapter.
That
Totally
works,
fine.
whatever makes you happy.
And then we can number
And this would just follow suit, be right after it.
the fixed assets funds, the follow after, yeah.
Okay. So I would ask one thing related to the communications activity, and that's I'd ask everybody to take a look at the draft statement. Let me know if you have any thoughts about wording changes or adjustments or additional material. I've got a note to self about, for the board part of that conversation, giving a little bit more background data about how did we get to where we are right now. Because you're right, that started, we started off with a rather generic description, and that morphed into 3 or 4 specific actions, and these are a couple of those specific actions, so we need to kind of tell that story. But if I could ask folks to do that by Friday, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, it's not a hard read. I don't like long reports. So, keep it, let me have any feedback you might have, and then I'll pick up that data and go forward with it. Certainly make sure that you get it because you'll be the first player who's gonna have to be involved in this and then if we're on a future agenda to come explain to the board what we did and why, I'd be glad to support that conversation.
I can remember most details, but I like the way this is written.
All right. So, unless there's any other conversation on that topic, that looks like I've got the actions I've got the action to rewrite the policy statement. You guys have the action, the committee has the action to review the communications statement, give me any feedback, and then I'll clean that up and distribute it out. There were just checking on a couple legacy actions from the last time. We talked about whether or not the reserve policy had been through the board yet. The answer was no. Exact timing TBD. I do like your idea, Gary, of putting the two activities together when they go through the board review, because then they'll have both pieces to be able to compare and contrast to, which is a good idea. So the exact timing of that's TBD. Because the reserve funds policy has not yet been approved by the board, there's really no activity that can take place regarding engagement with the village financial advisors to see how to, if there's any advantage to restructuring the investment philosophy on those funds that are now going to be in emergency reserves. But we'll have to wait for the board action before that takes place. I'm trying to remember if there's any other loose ends that we assigned actions for recently that we haven't closed on. I think those are the ones that are in my head, but I may have missed one somewhere along the way. I'll apologize in advance if I did.
According to the minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Says Karina will forward budget calendar within a few weeks.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Thank you.
And then it says, we will plan to review the O&M tables by the end of the first quarter. We are on track for that.
I
That's
think
it.
I think it depends on the budget calendar.
Yeah. I understand that.
That's a good point.
And I haven't done that yet, obviously, so
That's okay.
I still have to update it for including the O&M steps.
Okay. Yeah. And I think from our standpoint, it's really a question of when are the O&M updates going to be put into place? Because there's no reason for us to start sloshing around in that mud puddle until that gets done, so.
And I've already told staff that it would be into the first quarter. I expect to have that done and start being presented. They've already started working on it when they were doing the 2021 or 2022 budget. But I'm going to modify the formatting so that it aligns a little bit better. So I'm gonna have to tell them to put the brakes on, let me go in and
Sure.
muddy it all up for them, and then
No.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's new, it's new stuff. Takes a little while to get a pace of all that and all that. It's okay. Okay, cool. Thank you. See anything in the notes on this, Tom?
No.
Okay.
You're sure.
Okay, cool. So I think, unless anybody has anything else, I think that is everything I had on the agenda for the day. Unless anybody has anything else, I would move for adjournment.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And I forgot something before I move to adjournment. We have some people in the back of the room. Did anybody have any questions, comments, observations? Everybody shaking their head no? Kelly, welcome. So, thank you very much, folks. Everybody have a wonderful day. And we may do this virtually in 2 weeks. We'll have to kind of see where COVID is at this point, I believe.